Well, hello, everyone. I have been looking forward to tonight for 5 weeks, and not just because it's the last session of producing this Truth Love Together virtual event, but also because it's such an important conversation. And I think it's such a unique conversation as we've kind of gone through this journey of what it means to hold truth and love together. The first module, what is truth? The second module, what is love? Third, how are we formed into people of truth and love? And then last week we talked about how to speak the truth in love. And this week we're going to talk about loving the victims of lies by telling the truth. And you could see how it all fits together and hopefully how it builds up to today. We talk about this a lot at the Colson Center, that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And that is absolutely the case on the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. Now, what we promised you was a conversation with two of our Module 5 speakers, Katy Faust and JP DeGance. JP is AWOL. I don't know where he's at. Hopefully he's saving marriage. Oh, wait, I'm seeing he just popped on the screen. We might actually have him here. We'll see if his video comes through, which would be great. JP, there you are.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's all right. That's all right. I'm glad you were able to join us.
We recently moved and have a new modem and all sorts of fun stuff around that. So.
Well, listen.
Or you just wanted to be the late entrance, which is okay.
I did. It's dramatic.
the grand entry. And no one believes that, JP, now after 5 weeks of quarantine, because everyone knows Zoom like the back of their hands. Like,
I know, it's true.
Everybody knows it. Well, let me do a couple housekeeping things here as we begin and before I formally introduce JP and Katy. We say around the Colson Center that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. In other words, it would be one thing if what we believed stayed in the privacy of our own heads or in our own homes or in our own houses of worship. But they impact other people and they create victims, sometimes unintentional victims, but victims nonetheless. And so all the sessions in Module 5 were built around the victims. And how do we care about the victims, from the unborn to children, to a new generation that just doesn't know what it means to be married and what marriage actually is. So all that was built into this module, and with the goal as we do, and because we hear Chuck Colson's voice haunting us in the back of our head, it's not enough to just believe something, you got to live it out. So a Christian worldview is not just what you say, it's not just what you think, it's not just what you argue or assume, it's what you actually live. We want your questions. Some of you have already sent in questions. So if you have additional questions based on the sessions of this past module, then you can put them in either the chat box or the Q&A box. And if you are watching on Facebook, you can type your questions there on Facebook. And Elise, who is the wizardly genius behind the scenes, will take those questions and text them to me. And hopefully we'll be able to get to your questions on Facebook as well. And if you haven't been able to keep up, we've had a remarkable numbers as far as those who have watched these videos for each module. And yet I'm still hearing from people to say, I haven't caught up yet, but I'm getting there. And I understand. But at the same time, we've gone well beyond our projections. In fact, we topped our projections in week 3, which to God be the glory. We're super excited about that and are hearing just wonderful things about how the content's helping you. But if you don't know what we're talking about tonight, we're essentially talking about the victims of bad ideas in 2 areas. And so you can ask your questions around that. Number 1 is the breakdown of marriage. The low rates of marriage, the high failure rates of those who do get married, the next generation having seen marriages fail and then having to do it themselves, and what the church can actually do other than point out that it's a problem. And JP's organization, Communio, why'd you have to name that? That's a hard, I like the name, but I like to read the name, but I can't actually, I always feel like I'm not saying it right.
Well, yeah, we always intentionally mispronounce it. We don't say the proper Latin pronunciation. We just say Communio.
Communio. All right, there we go.
Some of anybody listening who's in classical conversations and you're teaching your kids proper pronunciation of Latin terms.
See, that's what it is. I hang out with all these elite classical homeschooler families, you know, and so you kind of feel like intimidated. And then Katy Faust has led the charge in caring about the victims of the sexual revolution, or at least one set of victims of the sexual revolution, the ones that always get set aside in the name of adult happiness, and that is children. As I often say, the common myth from the beginning of the sexual revolution until today is the kids will be fine. And they have not been fine. And so if you miss Katy's sessions, or you haven't watched that, or if you missed JP's session, you need to go back and watch them. But that's our topic, caring for the kids who are the victims of the sexual revolution, and really marriage, which is a casualty, not only of the sexual revolution, but also other aspects of modern society. So what a wonderful set of questions already coming in. Type them in. You can find Katy's organization at thembeforeus.com, thembeforeus.com. And Elise, if you would put that in the chat, that would be great. And then you can also find JP's work at communio.org. And we'll go there. Let me just jump right in. I need to do this. Our sponsor, we want to thank Prison Fellowship Ministries, the organization that birthed us. Since we're talking about marriage and children, we can say Prison Fellowship birthed us, which is great. And we're grateful for them. And I know some of you have, through this, been exposed to our Colson Fellows program. We are taking applications right now. We have our biggest group of applicants ever. We also are excited that some of the changes that have been made make it a uniquely accessible program in case of quarantine, if we want to put it that way. So check that out at colsonfellows.org. The deadline to apply July 1st. You know, let me start, if it's okay, JP, with you.
Sure.
And Katy, I think you're going to want to weigh in on this as well. Blair sent this question in ahead of time. Can you please speak about what you've observed, and I think in your case, JP, what the data really says about the lack of serious ambition on the part of college-educated women in the 20s and 30s to get married and have children? It seems that many prioritize careers and other goals, traveling, self-discovery, playing the field until an age when the fertility window is rapidly closing. Katy, I know you deal so much with artificial reproductive technologies as a way of advancing adult happiness over the children's rights. It's just the way it's going to be going forward. You know, obviously we talk so much about young men being boneheads, right? And that's the real problem.
I was excited about this question. It's the $64,000 question. Why are young adults not getting married? Why are women not getting married? And why is it not being prioritized? I'm going to give some arguments from the data here to kick this off. There is, in college, if you're a college-educated woman, there are 35% more of you than college-educated men. Okay, so there's a massive gap, gender gap in higher education between women and men that began around, that flipped around 1980. And it may be north of 40% now. And in many colleges, there are colleges that are approaching gaps of 50% or more. And what we know from the research is sex ratio differences affect marriage rates. The counties in America that have the highest rates of marriage have the smallest gaps between women and men in education levels. Women generally marry men similarly educated, very similar levels. So where there's a huge gap between men and women on education, that's going to influence marriage rates. Counties like Aspen-Pitkin, Aspen in Colorado has the reverse. They have more men than women, and they've got one of the highest marriage rates in America. San Jose,
Aspen, Colorado does? Is that right?
Yeah, per capita. All this I'm citing from a phenomenal book called Datanomics, not written from a Christian perspective, but just on the data around sexual behavior as it relates to gender ratio differences. So first and foremost, that also spills into our churches. Okay, Communio does survey data with churches regularly. We've completed more than 10,000 completed surveys in the last about 90 days. And what we're finding among singles in churches is there's north of us, it's about a 70%, there's 70% of all singles in churches are women. Okay. So if two good places to meet a life partner is going to be college and is going to be church, and men aren't participating there. And so when we look and say, well, why aren't women prioritizing it? There's a much bigger problem as it relates to men dropping out of higher education, and if they're not married, they're not showing up to church disproportionately.
Yeah. Hey, what did you say the percentage of men was in the university versus women?
The percentage of there are as of, I think it was 2015. So I don't have data since 2015. There were 35% more women with in college than men.
Right, and some of those colleges, the imbalance is greater. I mean, that's you know,
the engineering schools, that's
right.
not the case, right? In fact, interestingly, Silicon Valley, within college educated adults, there's a majority of men, and so actually in Silicon Valley, there's actually a fairly high marriage rate amongst college educated.
Katie, what do you want to add to that?
Well, I think that we have been sold this myth, right, that women can have it all. And I think that they can. You just can't have it all at once. And so women, if you're serious about getting married and having a family, especially, you need to do that first, right? And so I know that there's a lot of women out there that struggle to find marriageable men. And that's a very real struggle. So I don't want to bypass that. But if you're thinking it's always going to be there, especially when it comes to procreating children naturally, the answer is no. You need to be very realistic about how narrow your fertility window is. And once you get above 30, it's not a snap for a lot of women. Once you get above 35, you're a geriatric pregnancy, honey. So look, your childbearing years, your best childbearing years are in your 20s. And so if you want a family, then if you have a marriageable guy, you need to go for it. And you know, the kids that I work with, so I say kids, I say adult, we work with a lot of adult children who come from situations of family breakdown, right? All of the stories in our story bank of kids who are speaking up about the needs for children's rights to be known and loved by their mother and father have been denied that right, either through divorce, death, abandonment, reproductive technologies, or because they had same-sex parents. And so a lot of them are really hesitant about getting into marriage because they haven't seen what a successful marriage looks like in their world. And so I'd say, you can't let that hold you back. If you feel like you're going to want marriage and kids, which most women do at some point, even if you don't feel that drive in your early 20s, you really need to look carefully about your priorities when you're in your early years.
I want to take a question, Katie, and throw it back to you, because you know what you're saying almost, you know, basically appealing to the woman's own sense of motivation at that point. What's the place then of education? And I you know, one of the questions is, you know, are these arguments getting traction with non-believers? And I want to come back to that in just a second. But before we go there, is there a lack? Is any of this due to a lack of teaching in the church? Like whether you want it or not, like this is the way God made you, you know, this is actually part of, you know, the fabric of the universe. And, you know, this is part of the Christian faith, the Genesis 1-2 narrative. What's the responsibility? And I guess, what's the grade? What kind of score would you give the churches in teaching this sort of thing to young women?
I'm not the right person to ask because I'm married to the pastor of our church. We talk a lot.
And he's been great. He's done the best job ever.
So good. We're actually just finishing up a marriage series right now. You know, we do a lot of discussions in our youth group about marriage and sex and sexuality. We've watched a lot of What Would You Say videos with our kids. You know, we talk a lot about this with, we've got a lot of different groups that are having conversations about this. And the church must be the forefront. We have this corner on, well, everybody has access to the truth about the importance of marriage and family if you're looking at the data. But the church actually has a corner on it when it comes to not just teaching it, but living it.
Yeah.
You know, I know most of our churches are rich in couples who have been faithful to one another and overcome incredible burdens. That is one of the main apologetics that the world needs right now.
Yeah. JP, let me go to you in terms of the data that you have seen. I mean, I know, for example, the work you guys did in Jacksonville targeted, can we find indications data-wise for failing marriages?
Yeah.
What are you seeing in terms of the attitude about marriage itself between the church and non-church individuals?
Yeah, what we know is if you are active in church, you're more likely to marry than someone who isn't active in
Okay.
church. However, this still is a big challenge for the church. Very frequently, I'm going to give a point that a friend of mine, Frank Hanna, told me years ago. He's a Christian businessman from Atlanta. So he was listening to Laura Bush give a talk and about her daughter. Then went on a sleepaway vacation with her boyfriend, and ended up on that vacation, her boyfriend proposed to her. And this is true. This is a evangelical Christian president, and his wife, and and she's talking to a room full of mostly Christian donors. And Frank had mentioned the point that 10 years earlier, the First Lady of the U.S. isn't saying that. We've had a massive change in what parents expect of their own kids and their own norms, right? And in the church, are we prioritizing when we talk to our own kids? How often do we talk to them about getting good grades? How often do we talk to them about getting into a good college? How much do we talk to them about having a good career? And then add up all those conversations and all that emphasis, and then compare it to how often do we talk about finding a good spouse? And how many times are we talking to them about prioritizing the vocation of marriage? And just numerically, are we as parents even prioritizing in our own raising our own children the importance of marriage? And until certainly we have to win back our Christian elites on this. And we also have to kind of rattle the cage, proverbially speaking, of the church in the pews, that we have to, if we're not making these conversations a priority when they're 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, if we can talk to a 7-year-old about their grades, then why couldn't we talk to them about the importance of marriage when they grow up?
Hey, Michael wants to ask you, JP, if the data demographic map that you used in your talk is available to the public. Is that something that you could share?
Make sure I'm answering. I want to make sure I'm going to refer the demographic map on the the data as it relates to marriage and church participation is
That's a great question. I'm not sure, Michael, if you could maybe.
That particular one is going to be published. We funded the research with a phenomenal guy, Mark Regnerus, and he's got a book coming out soon that is citing that. And so it'll be really publicly available, I think, at some point over the next year.
I read everything Mark writes. That's one place you can go. Then Mark Regnerus. He actually, by the way, 2 years ago, speaker at our Wilberforce weekend event. And I think he's done it more than once. And we've had him on the podcast. So we'll link to those things there as well. Michael, if you have any more details about which demographic map specifically you were talking about, maybe we can get it down a little bit more. So, Katy, I'll go back to you, because one of the questions is, how do we help the younger generation? What can parents say to their kids who are confused on all of this? And there was an interesting thing this week that happened, and actually just in the last 24 hours, in which a guy named Kevin DeYoung, who's a kind of Reformed Baptist pastor, wrote an article in the Gospel Coalition about the new culture war. And basically what he was saying is the new strategy is get married, have lots of kids, and surprise everyone at Target who are going to ask you for the hope that's within you that would possess you to have so many kids. And, it was something that struck me as being non-controversial just, 5, 10, 15 years ago. The backlash now that he has received has been really stunning. Now, maybe it's relegated to Twitter, and I just wrote a commentary that Twitter isn't really the real world, and I want to stand by that as much as possible. But there does seem to be this thing. Anytime somebody says, "Hey, marriage is a good thing, you should try it," that there's a generation in the church saying, "You're idolizing marriage, you're idolizing motherhood. There's more to it. What about us singles? What about us who can't?" Or struggle with infertility, or, there's always this, well, what about us? What about us? And you can't really talk about that. How do you respond to that?
I'll try to pull in a little bit of, I'm very practical, but let me just get a little, I'll pull in a little bit of my husband's influence here and say, it feels like there's been different kind of epochs of church history. And right at the turn of the century, like for the first couple hundred years, the debate is, what is the nature of God? And we were talking about, who is Jesus? Is he 50% God, 50% man? Is it modalism? I mean, is he 100%? I mean, it took us a while to debate that and figure it out. And then you hit the Reformation and you're talking about, okay, well, what is the church and what is the nature of salvation and how does that happen? Today, the place where the teachings of Scripture are coming up against culture has to do with the question, what does it mean to be human? Okay, everything. When does life begin? When does it end? How do you deal with it? What's the nature of sexuality? What is male and female? What is marriage? Okay, all of those are fundamentally questions about what does it mean to be human. So in all of those questions, and I'm not saying that you should avoid teaching on like core doctrinal truths, which is really important, but the place where your kids are going to be challenged is all of these places about what does it mean to be human. So my answer is, how do you do that with your kids? You make them experts. Do you understand me, people? You make them experts. Now, my personal philosophy is I do a lot of sheltering of my kids up until they're about 10 or 11. And I just saturate them in truth and beauty. And I try to avoid situations where they're watching information that is presenting competing worldviews or exposing them to people that might try to derail their faith. But once they get to be middle schoolers, I purposefully expose them to challenging content in my home, right? I'll be reading an article or watching something on YouTube and I'll say, come here and watch this with me. I want to talk this through with you. What do you think about it? We'll read an article together and it will challenge their worldview. Right. I tell them, I did this with my oldest daughter when she was going into public school for the first time as a 6th grader. And she would say, oh my gosh, Mom, are we going to talk about abortion again? Why? And I said, yes, because I want you to know more about this than anyone else. Do you understand? And so she has had all of my kids have had several challenging conversations. And sometimes they don't know everything, but they know enough to spot a lie. And a lot of times they know enough to speak up and make their friends go, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense, right? So I would just say, I totally get the urge to shelter your children. You are handing them over to the culture if you choose to do that in middle school and high school, right? You must equip them. And I would say equip them to the point where they have a lot of confidence going into a conversation with their peers. And I'm not saying it's Fight Club, right? I'm not saying go in there and they pick fights with everybody. But equip them to the point where they can stand firm. Nobody, they should have enough information so that they never feel like they're blown back by the world.
JP, so in the research and the data here, there's some questions about what can churches do? And I think it's such an interesting question. We heard from Katy what she and her husband do there at their church. The churches that you saw, you saw this dramatic thing happen in Jacksonville and a few other places. What specifically did the churches do that they weren't doing before that made all the difference? Are you muted? Not if you're muted. You are muted. Yes, I see it. There's a little microphone down at the bottom. There we go. Oh.
I was not allowed to unmute myself. There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Well, right. The question, I want to just quickly just speak very briefly to what the question asked Katy, because it's the idea that that the church idolizes marriage. You're right. It absolutely does, and it should. That doesn't reduce or change the dignity of the single life. I mean, St. Paul speaks very, very highly of those who choose to live a life of celibacy, for instance. But our soteriology is rooted in God's story for how he loves us is a spousal relationship. And we shouldn't run from that. We shouldn't hide from that, right? So and Rodney Stark, a great historian on the rise of Christianity, points out that it was Christian marriage and the example of the equality of dignity between the spouses that helped convert the world, where the pagans looked and said, there's something different there. And I believe that the church refocusing on our marriages and promoting the virtue of great healthy marriages, there's something magnetic about a Christ-centered godly marriage that the world loves, okay? And it is a great practical apologetic. So you asked a question about, John, about church, I apologize, as it relates to churches in Jacksonville. If you don't mind repeating that.
No, just really, I mean, there's always the question, so what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And I've got a follow-up to it as well. But what the churches that saw the biggest movement in their ability to help save marriages that were at risk, this remarkable reduction in the divorce rate, for example, what did they do that they weren't doing before that made the difference?
Almost no churches had in-house skills-based ministries, okay? That's really important. The research shows that 8 hours or so a year, at least 8 hours, that's sort of a minimum dosage, of skills-based couples relationship education produces a measurable increase in relationship health quality and a reduction in your likelihood of divorce, okay? And churches will frequently have the vision. If they do something right, it's the teaching on what marriage is. That's good. But the skills of how to live a healthy marriage, frequently we can have our theology down and not the practical life experiences of how to live a great marriage. What are learned practices of communication skills training, helping a couple establish shared and mutual expectations, reinforcing the lifelong commitment of marriage routinely. Skills ministries that do that. We helped through some key local partners. Live Life Ministries was just a phenomenal local partner, helped churches in Jacksonville deliver a variety of skills-based ministries directly in their congregations. That was huge. I think the numbers, just 28% of churches on a national level, according to a survey we commissioned with the Barna Group, have a substantive marriage ministry. Skills-based ministry is just not really there in the church, and that was a big learning. The second thing, really briefly, John, is people aren't super ready to jump into a skills-based ministry. Okay, they both need it and frequently won't show up. Okay, so how do you cause them to show up? A lot of it is we'll work with churches on developing an ongoing strategy that builds a larger and larger audience interested in it. So a date night series, couples ministry that's less programmatic initially, and help people flow gradually into skills-based ministry through groups and other formats. But there's a number of ways that can play out.
Did you see any of them find a way to do this and at the same time? I'll go back to the example of Kevin DeYoung's piece, and there is this critical response that the church is worshiping marriage as if we can only elevate marriage or elevate singleness. We can't do both. We can only do skills-based, like here's how to be married, or skills-based, here's how to be single.
Well, I want to make sure that we talk about singlehood the right way. I think singleness, if I've heard this, and I've gone into trainings at churches where this has come up, where even staff will say things like, well, I just want to be single. And so you want to pry a little bit on that. Do you mean that you've committed to a life without courtship and dating? And well, no, I'm still dating people, but you want to be single. So what are you trying to achieve? What is the purpose of the dating if your goal is to be single? I think certainly helping people to live single life well is great. when we serve churches, we help them form what we call a full circle relationship ministry, and that is practical skills-based ministry for singles. How does a single person? 35% of singles, when we run our surveys, are unsatisfied with their own personal relationships, much higher than married people. Okay, and so there's a place for the church to help, even with skills-based ministry, on our own friendships, and then when and if we decide to date somebody and discern marriage, how do you do that well? All of that is something that the church generally just assumes a couple shows up married or they show up engaged, and there's very little of anything else that's before that. A great marriage, a healthy marriage, starts decades before the wedding day, and I think this is where the church, this is one of the next great frontiers on strengthening marriage. And we've been really excited about the progress we've seen churches make in developing ministry for singles that celebrates marriage still, but makes and helps folks that are single not feel unwelcome, really helps them feel like this is a great place for them. And the pivot there is on relationships, healthy relationships, that helps everybody feel like they have a place at the table, and then help folks think through and live and learn the skills of healthy relationships.
Hey, Katy, I think that one of the things at the heart here is that there so often the evangelical sexual ethic is, well, the Bible doesn't explicitly, forbid it, but I did it and it was okay, or, it's just not grounded very well across the board. We don't have kind of a theology of the body for Protestants that has really taken hold. And I want to go specifically to artificial reproductive technologies. So just recently at the Colson Center, we talked about the legalization of commercial surrogacy. And in my view, surrogacy itself is ethically problematic, but commercial surrogacy is, if surrogacy is going the wrong way, down a one-way street, commercial surrogacy is going 70 miles over the speed limit the wrong way down a one-way street. It's got additional problems. But you spend so much time. Could you start framing out kind of a grounding for an evangelical ethic that can help us start thinking through all these issues? I mean, in 3 sentences or less. But it's a big question. But it just feels like the ethical reflection on this is so shallow for so many Christians.
So you got the wrong Faust if you want a really long theological discussion about this. But I'm the practical application Faust in our relationship, and this is what it looks like to me. Nothing in Scripture says that you have the right to make a child sacrifice for you. Nothing. No matter how much you hurt or how much you long for it, how much pain you've gone through and the road that you've walked, nothing. You don't get to make a child sacrifice for you. And that is a premise that we understand pretty well in the pro-life world, right? That we say, look, we understand that you're scared, that you're in a crisis pregnancy, that you don't have support. And so we come alongside and we bear your burden. But none of that justifies violating a child's right to life. Now we need to take that very real scriptural mandate, right? We as Christians are called to care for the orphan and the fatherless. It is one of the 4 demographics that God hammers over and over and over and over as deserving special protection from his people. All of these different ways of thinking about marriage and sex and reproduction have to do with manufacturing fatherless children. And so departures from the married mother-father home literally puts children at risk. And so I understand that there is some conversations to be had about IVF in general, and so I'm not going to touch that. But what I will say that is clear cut to me is if any child is sacrificing their right to life, their right to a mother and father, their right to be bonded to both of them daily in marriage, you are now straying away from core biblical concepts of adults doing hard things so that children are protected. So that's the question. If I can boil it right down for Christians, I can say, are you asking a child to sacrifice something for you, something they have a fundamental right to, so you can have something that you want? If you are, you are stepping outside of God's will. And so
I think that's a pretty good theological framework, honestly. I mean, you know, we can go back to Genesis and, you know, we can go to the other Faust if we want to, but I want you to repeat those three fundamental rights. Cause I think that's just, I mean, those are good pegs to hang these things on.
So that obviously the primary child right, which is the primary human right, is the right to life. And that is why we rightly see so many organizations, many of them Christian, defending a child's fundamental right to life. But children also have another fundamental right, and it is the right to be known and loved by the two people responsible for their existence. Statistically, those are the two people who are the most likely to be protective of, connected to, and invested in the child. When we look at from the 30,000 foot range, that is the scenario that stacks the deck in favor of child thriving. And so we do not get any kind of thriving society without these norms, this norm of children being connected to and loved by their mother and father. And the other one I threw in the end is they need them every day, right? It's not like they need mom on this weekend and dad during the week. Children are made for the daily love, involvement, and connection of both parents, and they get that through marriage. That's why at Them Before Us, we talk about marriage as a social justice issue for children, because marriage is the only institution that unites the two people to whom children have a natural right, and then gives them the best shot at avoiding all of the social ills that grieve all of our hearts every day.
The questions that are coming in are just fantastic. Thanks. Keep them. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. JP, let me ask you this question from Stuart, because I've heard this and I didn't quite get it at first, but since you did so much work in Jacksonville, and that's not that far from Orlando, which is not that far from the Villages, which has a legendary reputation in Florida, if you know what I'm talking about. It's a retirement community.
I've heard.
Yeah, exactly. I hear it's like geriatric spring break in certain corners of it. That's the reputation it has. I don't know if that's true or not, but the question is, and I hear this, that there's this trend, it seems, of older couples, you know, Christian, non-Christian, conservative, just because, you know, maybe in the age demographic, that have chosen cohabitation for tax reasons, you know, as opposed to the marriage penalty, or maybe it's because it has something to do with, you know, inheritance rights and, you know, protecting assets and things like that. And it's like all of a sudden marriage, well, we done that, you know, been there, done that, lost my wife, divorced my wife, you know, and so we're just going to live together. Is that a trend?
You know, I haven't dove into the data around elderly cohabitation, but I can say anecdotally, it certainly is a trend that I've seen, and there's great. It's a great scandal to their family, really. If you've got elderly grandparents who aren't living in a way that is biblically consistent because of something that is expeditious, like more favorable tax policy or a way to save money, or, you know, fill in the blank, practical inheritance rights, these sorts of things. What are we communicating to our kids? What's the message we're sending to our grandkids? Now, cohabitation is a massive, widespread problem within the church. Okay, any pastor who's forming a young couple for marriage will tell you it's out of control. You're talking north of 70% of marriages that show up at the church are likely cohabitating, in broadly speaking. Now, there's all sorts of reasons people typically give for it. In the research that we did as to what are the emotional drivers of it, frequently they're not said, okay? And the left brain reasons people give is because, A, we can save rent. It's more practical because we can combine incomes, all those sorts of things. But you can, I mean, obviously I can get a roommate and save money. Like that's not really bottom line the real reason. What came up in our research is that very frequently young adults have seen trauma in their own family life. They've seen really dysfunctional marriages, and they're scared of marriage itself. And they think it's a rational way to sample or test marriage in order to not have the wounds that they saw and experienced themselves as a child. That is the most frequently uncovered reason in our, we did long form quantitative research back in 2015 with respondents, 90-minute interviews. When you really uncovered it, that was the most common, frequently given reason. Now, but pastors understand this also speaks to the need for a message that speaks truth with compassion. I mean, the whole theme of this entire conference. If we understand that there's that decision is frequently coming out of a level of woundedness, then I have to overcome my inclination naturally, which is to kind of scold somebody, like, what are you doing? One of the best ways to get a change in behavior there, a metanoia in how they view their own sexual ethic, is then going to have to speak into that and produce a mindset shift that speaks to that deep emotional reason why they're doing this, right? That actually a healthy marriage is possible, that you can do it, and the skills to live it are out there. And actually, if you choose, there's certain things that you can do to make it more risky for your marriage and make more likely for your marriage to fail. And I know that you think that you're making it a safer decision, that you're actually taking a more risky decision. 40% of the kids who are conceived in a cohabitating relationship are fatherless in 5 years. Okay, 70% of them are fatherless by age 12. Okay, so it's, to speak to Katy, it's unjust for them, and those moms and dads don't want it either, but they think that they're making the rational, safe decision because of their fears.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, something you said early on there, JP, that I just want to highlight is it's something that I think also that the church can do to counteract this, at least trend among the elderly generation, is help them to know. I just feel like sometimes we take the older folks in our church and we send them on the tour bus to Branson, at least before COVID-19. And, you just kind of go do your thing, have your pancake breakfast and leave us younger folks alone. I'm not sure there's a more powerful witness to marriage than a successful, lifelong, beautiful marriage. I'm profoundly changed by watching my grandfather take care of my grandmother, and then my grandmother take care of my grandfather, and they were married for 72 years. I mean, that's crazy. I can't even imagine living 72 years, and they were married 72 years. And there's just such a, in a culture where there's not enough examples, that's a great one. All right, Katy, this is the question. Oh, sorry. Do you want to jump in there, JP?
No, I was just going to say, and actually, one of the great tragedies of modern life is that the norm is to move parents into a nursing facility or living. In fact, parents themselves feel like they're a burden and don't want to be. But even, there's some dear friends of ours who've made a sacrifice to have their elderly married parents live with them. And it's beautiful to sacrifice as those parents to their kids, and a beautiful witness to their kids of their grandparents' love for one another.
Wow. There's a lot there that could be unlocked between what you just said and what Katy said earlier about sacrifice. What do we expect from children? And then, I remember, I think it was Jody Bottom, who has this wonderful way of writing that makes you just scared of the future. And he said something like, we got to remember it's the kids that, watched all their brothers and sisters get aborted that we're asking to take care of us when we're old, and it's like this stuff kind of comes back to roost. All right, Katy, I want you to weigh in on this. I get this question every time I talk about same-sex marriage. I talk about the observable biological difference between same-sex relationships and heterosexual relationships, even if I don't weigh into morality at all, just talking about biology, it goes to gay adoption. And the argument is, well, aren't kids going to be better in a home instead of an institution? So shouldn't we allow gay couples to adopt? How do you respond to that?
Number one, we need to have a proper understanding of adoption. And that is a child-centric institution that exists to provide parents to children who have lost them. It is not a means for adults to get kids. It's not a way for an infertile couple to build their family. It's not a way for same-sex couples to have a family. None of that. It is a way for society to mend the wound of children who have lost their parents. Okay, number one, it's not about adults. Adults are not the client. The child is the client. Now that we've established that the child is the client, we need to recognize that children benefit from dual gender parenting. And therefore, prioritizing a home with a mother and father should be something that's not just allowed, but encouraged. Number two, stability matters. And so we should be able to prioritize homes where there's a married couple, not a cohabiting couple and not a single, okay? Then you also need to do all of the general physical fitness of the parents, financial fitness, ability to handle special needs. At them before us, we think it's important to keep sibling groups together so they can keep their biological siblings. And then given all of that, the social worker needs to make the best placement given the child that's in question and the available parents. And so in as many situations as possible, I hope that is a married, heterosexual Christian couple, right? However, that's not always possible. Now, I personally know a situation where there was a gay couple and they were matched with a child in an institution overseas. And I know for a fact that this little girl, because of her special needs, was passed over by probably 12 heterosexual couples, many of whom would call themselves Christians. But they didn't choose to take on what ended up being yearly surgeries for this girl because she had a pretty significant condition. And they said, you know, Katy, we need help. And this is going to be a hard trip. And you've got a history in adoption. Will you go with us? I said, yep, I will. And so I traveled with those two women and they came home with the child, and it was a grueling couple weeks. But the alternative for this kid was to stay in an underfunded institution and probably die. So I would say that if we as Christians have a problem with that scenario, more Christian families probably need to be taking on hard cases. And and all of that to say that sometimes a same-sex home is better than an orphanage by no means that we disregard that an ideal exists and that there is an ideal, and we need to uphold that ideal, and we need to understand what it is. And none of that justifies redefining marriage into a genderless institution, right? When you look at adoption as an institution that serves the needs of children, sometimes you don't always get the ideal. Sometimes a single mom who's fostering a child and already has a relationship with that child may be the best placement, especially if she might have a biological connection to the child and be able to keep that child in their kinship network. So it's, you know, I know that's not an easy answer. It's a little bit messy, but that's, to me, that's the one that kind of captures all of the reality that's on the ground.
Yeah. Well, so let me hit another aspect of that, because it also doesn't seem to me when the question is asked, and I think you navigated that masterfully. You know, I mean, look, in a you know, a situation where there's a desperation, then we do what we need to do.
And let me jump in and say, you know, a member of our staff who was raised by two dads wrote an op-ed in the Tennessean when they were debating this last year, end of last year, and she said, we, as them before us, we take a strong stance towards adoption agencies that want to prioritize married mother-fathers homes, because whenever possible, children need to be able to benefit from maternal love and paternal love, right? Developmentally, they need it. Just on a heart level, they crave it. Every child wants to be loved by a daddy and a mommy. And so we are in full support of allowing adoption agencies to prioritize that. And then we also understand that, especially with foster kids these days, sometimes that ideal isn't available.
Yeah. One of the things, though, that I think needs to be brought into this conversation is what you saw in Seattle and what we saw in New York during the COVID-19 crisis, which is the legalization of commercial surrogacy and the push for artificial reproductive technologies, especially surrogacy, as a requirement for gay couples to be able to have children that, quote unquote, they call their own. Mm-hmm. Is there really, I mean, and as I understand it, the legislators that drove that legislation, both in Seattle and New York, were gay married individuals. So we look at that and say, is this really a, you know, what, are there really gay couples not being allowed to adopt, or is there now a growing reality of couples that have chosen a union, a sexual union that isn't fertile by nature, and now hoping to have children, including quote unquote children of their own.
Well, a lot of people don't want to adopt because it's hard. And it is hard. But that's what adults are supposed to do. We're supposed to do hard things. We're not supposed to make kids do hard things. So yes, adoption is hard and you should do it anyway. I'm an adoptive mom. I've got an incredible kid. He's got some special needs. So, you know, I'm never going to try to over romanticize this as fixing everything, but it is 100% the right thing to do. And every Christian should probably take a hard look at what they could do to serve the modern day orphans in our world. So I understand why some same-sex couples may not be drawn to adoption. It's challenging. Another reason why they may not be drawn to adoption is because many of them long to have a biological connection with their child. They think, well, we'd like to have some biological connection. I'd like to use my egg or our sperm or something like that, because doesn't that feel important to you? It kind of matters. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody running around that looks like you? And it does matter. And that longing to have somebody who's biologically connected to you come from you is a very human longing. What amazes me is that they can recognize the biological importance of having a biological child and then completely disregard the fact that they are cutting out half of that child's biological parentage by creating a child through reproductive technologies. So biology matters when it comes to them wanting a biological connection, but they expect the child to be just fine without half of their parentage. And so to me, that is the perfect example of this child-centric mentality that we have about reproductive technologies. This is what I want, so I should be able to have it regardless of what the child has to lose, but they're going to be happy with it because this is what I want.
JP, a couple questions have come in terms of the marriage, well, the data-driven kind of indicators of marriage being in trouble, and asking, okay, what are the real numbers when it comes to porn use and the risk that plays to marriage?
It's a massive threat to marriage. It can be a major impediment to having, the core of marriage is a healthy sexual embrace, right? And pornography itself makes that less likely to happen in a healthy way. That is, I don't think it's an underestimation to say that I mean, there's many threats to marriage, but the ubiquitous nature of pornography, the easy access of it through our mobile devices, through just our regular desktop computers, just everywhere, is we know now it rewires the brain, that the sexual climax through pornography releases neurochemicals that ultimately rewire the way we think, the way we react, and the way we react to future sexual stimulus, and making us less satisfied in our spouse or a future spouse. And I've personally known a number of good church-going men whose marriages have failed because of their addiction to pornography, and they deeply regret it. And frequently, in fact, one really dear friend who's I would say he's been in years in recovery now from his addiction to pornography. It started for him at the age of 12. He was an addict, and he brought it into his marriage, and it destroyed his marriage. He has since really broken that addiction and has a lot of accountability partners, and praise God, he's found a great woman who he will be marrying, and but it's a huge issue, and I think the church can be much more. A lot of times we're too puritanical about talking about these challenges. Yeah, and there's ways to talk about it, right? Obviously, on a Sunday morning with all the kids there at all ages may not be the best way to talk about it openly, but we need to confront it in the church and be practical about it, and in good, healthy men's groups, it needs to be talked about, in marriage formation, in single. This is why we talk about a full circle relationship ministry, having effective ministry for those who are single, those who are married, those who are engaged, and those who are in crisis. You got to know what are the resources for folks struggling with that. How do you help folks set the right habits of life that keep you away from it? How do we make it easy for us to be good is something that should also be thought about. I want to raise Mark Regnerus's research in his book, Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy, identified some really horrifying statistics about the rise of pornography among women. What he found is women under the age, I think it was under the age of 23, if you remember reading in the book, had the same pornography usage rates of men over the age of 50, which is significant. It's not as high as men at the age of 25, but it's very high, and that's a trend that continues to grow, and so we shouldn't be think that pornography is exclusively in the church a male issue alone. It is a majority male issue, but with a very significant percentage of women, and particularly young women, young adult women, struggling with it.
Somebody asked Mark's last name, so I'm typing it in here in the chat box. Regnerus.
That's the way you spell it.
Yeah, and the book Cheap Sex is absolutely worth the price of admission. It's just it's fantastic, as is the video. And this is my homework assignment everywhere I talk about this stuff.
By the way, don't read Mark's book. I just want to say, if you get his book and you're on an airplane, I don't know how many of you will be on an airplane soon. Yeah, it's maybe better to take off the cover.
Yeah.
I did that when I was running around, like, maybe I want to take this off.
Yeah, it's just Cheap Sex. That's probably not the one you want your seatmate to see. But check out his YouTube video called The Economics of Sex, which sums up a lot of the key points of that as well. Just super important. Katy, interesting question here. Is there any way, this is coming off Facebook, is there any way that those who are single can serve marriage? And I think we often say, well, babysit. And I, as someone with kids, I feel that, right? Please come babysit. But I think that's trivial. That's not taking singleness seriously. But so I want to go a little bit further. I think there are single individuals who want to be married, they can't, or maybe that God's called them to celibacy and singleness, but they so understand that this is really important. That church needs to get this right. How have you seen that done well?
Oh, my heart is for you. If you're out there and you're single and you long to be married, or maybe not, I will just say that, and the statistically you're going to be. Like statistically, there's a really good chance that you're going to be married. So I would just say, whether you're single now or single forever, allow God to do something really big through you now. You actually have a measure of freedom and availability to do big things that women like me don't. Honestly, I mad dashed in here after doing a day of party prep for my 17-year-old and taking my boys to the skate park while trying to answer emails and write an article about I just have so little time to do some of these big things that I feel like God has called me to. Ask God, what is the big thing that he has for you now? Because there's a really good chance that a season is coming when you're not going to be as free to pursue that. You right now have incredible amounts of time and resources when it comes to energy to put into something that I don't have. So maximize it. And I don't know what that is for you. And if you have a heart towards strengthening marriage, take that to the Lord and say, give me some details, God. What is it that you want from me? And then let him do something new through you.
Yeah. Well, we are just about out of time, and it's a great discussion. Thank you all for all of your questions, and I want to say thanks to Katy and JP. Again, you can find Katy's website, thembeforeus. Is it org? Thembeforeus.org? No, .com.
Baby.
Yeah, thembeforeus.com. And she's just got some terrific stuff out there, and a new book coming at some point. We're still in the publishing process, right, Katy? So we're talking a couple months out, but it's going to be a great book.
Probably February 2021 is what we're thinking.
Well, I've seen a sneak preview, and it is as good as it gets. The only other book I know like it was a highly academic book by Helen Alvarez trying to deal with children's rights more on a legal level, and that book costs $150. So because it's a real expensive one, it's a good one, but it's super expensive.
It's more college textbook worthy.
Right.
That's right. That's right. So
Yeah, you're gonna get the budget version from me.
well, it's not budget on content. It's, you know, the words are smaller, but that's a good thing. It's way more understandable, but it's such an important thing. JP, people can follow you at communio.org. You're doing such interesting things. And I would encourage you to go to the website and especially click on the digital toolbox so you can kind of see how this organization is actually helping Christians save marriage. Like, it's actually working. We have the numbers, and JP, that's got to be super satisfying and encouraging, and just grateful for that work that you do as well.
Thank you. No, it's been amazing to see what happens when the church focuses in on this challenge. I think, I jokingly say, why didn't small Baptist churches in 19th century America have marriage ministries? The whole culture was imbued with marriage and the culture. That's no longer the case. And so I think the dynamics fundamentally changed over the last 60 years. And now it's time for the church to roll up its sleeves and get practical about helping folks live marriage well. And we can actually, through our lives, live that apologetic of Christianity, of a truly Christ-centered.
I mean, can you imagine? I mean, it's kind of what Kevin DeYoung said. I mean, can you imagine a church full of healthy marriages? I mean, I can't think of another thing that would cause a watching world to ask about the hope that's within us, if they can kind of see that up close and personal. And that would include from watching our well-adjusted 20-some-year-olds and young men not acting like, Peter Pan idiots, and, everything in between. So there's just a lot there. I want to remind everyone to check out the work of Prison Fellowship Ministries, Prison Fellowship, the other legacy organization of the Colson, of Chuck Colson, along with the Colson Center. They do remarkable work in the prisons. If you're not a part of Angel Tree, which helps reconnect kids with their parents who are incarcerated on behalf of their parents. Oh man, that's a really an amazing way to be the church in this kind of time. And there's also a remarkable amount of work being done with justice reform that's bipartisan. I don't know of another bipartisan initiative on the planet right now other than maybe prison reform. So that's really super exciting to see that work go forward. So Prison Fellowship, you can find them at pfm.org. Also, if you have gone through Truth Love Together and this sort of learning is exciting and you want to take your deepening of your faith to a new level, the Colson Fellows program was put together by Chuck Colson. It's one of the legacy ways that he wanted to see people trained to live out their faith in the cultural context in which God has placed them. Cultural leadership is not just in DC and Hollywood, and it's not just up to some of us professionals who do this for a living. Every Christian, wherever they're at, is placed in a cultural moment, in a cultural context, called to live out their faith in that culture in a restorative way, like what you've heard tonight from Katy and JP. And so if the Colson Fellows program, if that sort of vision is attractive to you, check us out at colsonfellows.org, colsonfellows.org. And you can join about probably 450 other Colson Fellows this year from all over the country that will be walking through a deepening of their faith and Christian worldview, cultural analysis, and local leadership. So it's an exciting program, and check that out. The registration deadline is July the 1st. So Katy, JP, it's been great to be with you guys tonight. Appreciate your answers, tackling these tough questions. Thanks for your sessions during the Truth Love Together event. They were really terrific, and just, man, great job closing out what was a great 5-module, 5-week event.
Thank you, Hayden. Thank you. And Katy, good to meet you here virtually.
Yeah.
And thank you, John.
Yeah, nice to meet you. I mean, we got to talk, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You do. Absolutely. I love putting kingdom people together. So, all right. Well, God bless everyone. Thanks again. And you can still access the videos of the Truth Love Together event at conference.colsoncenter.org. We'll send all that out with the email following this webinar. God bless you guys. Good night.
America is called the land of the free. Would it surprise you to know that the United States has the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world? Right now, 2.2 million people are behind bars. 1 in 28 children has a mother or father in prison. That is outrageous. These statistics make it clear that something is dangerously out of balance in the American criminal justice system. The Bible calls us to seek justice and remember those in prison. But how do we apply that calling? Our goal is to teach you about the American criminal justice system and the fundamental values and principles of our faith that should guide your response. Biblical justice is about restoring broken people, relationships, and communities through solutions that reflect their God-given value. This vision of justice is so radical, so outside the box, that some would even call it outrageous. Our Outrageous Justice small group curriculum invites you to gather with fellow believers to study and discuss what the Bible says about justice, crime, and incarceration, and how we as Christians should respond to advancing justice that restores. This 6-week video-based curriculum offers practical biblical content in an engaging, interactive format. You'll hear stories of people who have been in prison, crime victims, families, prison wardens, and others. You'll have the opportunity to build relationships with others as you learn together. We invite you to join us to discover the power and promise of outrageous justice. Justice and the value of human life in our prisons isn't just a little side note to our Christian walk on earth. It is actually a centerpiece in Scripture. For more information on how your church or small group can access the curriculum, please go to www.prisonfellowship.org/outrageousjustice or email outrageousjustice@pfm.org.